Fastnacht gives expression to the unconscious truth of the Swiss psyche. Unconscious religion is a theme which became prominent in Jung's ideas in later life. By the time Jung had completed his studies in Basel, he had himself experienced the reality of the unconscious psyche and the independent energy of dreams. Jung began his professional career in 1900. He met and married Emma Rauschenbach, and in 1908 the Jungs built the lakeside house at Kusnacht, where they spent almost 50 years together. Professionally, Jung was following the lead of Sigmund Freud, the Viennese originator of psychoanalysis and the study of the unconscious. Jung and Freud first met in 1909. They felt an immediate affinity for each other. Jung was the pupil and Freud the master. Freud today is considered the more significant theorist and thinker, but Jung's influence as a practical psychiatrist is equally important. Analyst Andrew Samuels.
You know it's possible to watch films on Jung, to read books on Jung, and not know that the guy was a psychiatrist? That until he became old and rather bored with it, he saw patients? That he wrote paper after paper about how to do therapy? That there are 1,200 Jungian analysts in the world and thousands more therapists who are influenced by Jungian ideas and by analytical psychology? He was interested in psychopathology. He had something to say about depression. He had something to say about schizophrenia. He had something to say about hysteria.
Jung regarded schizophrenic fantasies as having no less value than dreams, and just as much reality of meaning for the individual patient. His approach was completely new. He invited his patients to paint their dream images or their fantasies and bring them to concrete reality. His conviction in the reality of the psyche has influenced many modern approaches to mental illness.
He must have been the first person in Europe to use dancing and art and things like that as therapy for patients. He took the view that we needed to express ourselves, and the works of art, or the little talismans, he called them, that we produce are means to our own spiritual growth.
Jung saw the unconscious as creative and independent. Freud thought it just contained what the conscious mind repressed. The more Jung investigated the unconscious, the less he could agree with Freudian theory.
After my association experiments, when I realized that there is obviously an unconscious, the question was, now, what is this unconscious? Does it consist merely of rests, of remnants, of conscious activities, or are there things that are practically forever unconscious? In other words, is the unconscious a factor in itself? And I soon came to the conclusion that the unconscious must be a factor in itself, because I observed time and again that, for instance, dreams or schizophrenic patients' delusions and fantasies contain the motives which they couldn't possibly have acquired in our surroundings.
Jung and Freud were very different men, with different approaches. Their split followed Jung's most original and controversial discovery, that of the collective unconscious, an idea which, characteristically, he deduced from a dream.
I was in a house I did not know. It was my house. In the upper story, there was a kind of salon furnished in Rococo style. I did not know what the lower floor looked like. There, everything was much older. This part of the house must date from the 15th or 16th century. The furnishings were medieval. The floors were of red brick. I went from one room to another, thinking, now I really must explore the whole house. I came upon a heavy door and opened it. A stone stairway led down into the cellar. Descending again, I found myself in a beautifully vaulted room which looked exceedingly ancient. The walls dated from Roman times. The floor was of stone slabs, and in one of these I discovered a ring. The stone slab lifted, and I saw a staircase of narrow stone steps leading down. I descended and entered a low cave. In the dust were scattered bones and broken pottery, like remains of a primitive culture. I discovered 2 human skulls, obviously very old and half disintegrated. Then I awoke. It was plain to me that the house represented a kind of image of the psyche. Consciousness was represented by the salon. It had an inhabited atmosphere. The ground floor stood for the first level of the unconscious. The deeper I went, the more alien and the darker the scene became. The Roman cellar and the prehistoric cave, these signified past times and past stages of consciousness. My dream obviously pointed to the foundations of cultural history, a history of successive layers of consciousness. My dream thus constituted a kind of structural diagram of the human psyche. It was my first inkling of a collective beneath the personal psyche.
To Jung's followers, his discovery of a collective unconscious is critical. It represents a deep and timeless fund of human instincts and images in the psyche, which Jung called archetypes.
This linking up of the cutting edge of psychological investigation with archaic thinking, with a kind of mental archaeology, this is fascinating to me, and it's really important for several reasons. Firstly, because it does away with the hubris or inflation of there being lots and lots of breakthroughs. And secondly, because the continuity of human ideation, thought, culture seems to me very important, particularly in our age, which in every sense is atomizing. We need to know that we're not actually different from what we were hundreds of thousands of years ago.
The instincts and archetypes together form the collective unconscious. I call it collective because, unlike the personal unconscious, it is not made up of individual and more or less unique contents, but of those which are universal and of regular occurrence.
After the split with Freud, Jung experienced a profound psychological turmoil, which he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Dr. Adolf Guggenbhül-Craig.
When he died, I think there was a leading article in one of the American journals who said he was actually psychotic, or they said he was a man who was schizophrenic and cured himself.
Jung resigned his hospital job. He was confronted by overpowering dreams and visions, and he struggled to express the images of his own unconscious in painting, sculpture, and word. Jung, who was never himself analysed, now began 4 years of intense self-analysis.
You can only deal with the unconscious by images, and he had a great gift to deal with images, but there is no special method. I mean, you could ask, was there any special method by which Dante was able to walk through hell and purgatory and heaven? There was no method, he just was able to do it.
By 1920, the crisis had passed. Jung emerged to undertake 40 years of study, writing, and working with patients. He began to consider how the rift which arose between himself and Freud was attributable to their different character or type, and how people's psychological outlook in general could be defined. In 1921, Jung published Psychological Types.
I've never known anything that was as illuminating as that book was. Suddenly we'd got tools to work with. Instead of trying to exterminate each other, we could understand much better why we were the way we were and why we came on as we did come on, and so forth and so forth. And it was enormously helpful.
Oh, it was a revelation. It was absolutely revolutionary in our lives.
Jo and Jane Wheelwright were both patients of Jung and both became analysts. More than 50 years ago, Jung's English assistant gave Jo Wheelwright a copy of Psychological Types, the work which gave us the terms introvert and extrovert and the 4 psychological functions. Jung defined 4 main types from his observations of patients, friends and colleagues: thinking, feeling, sensation and intuition.
Well, there is quite a simple explanation of these terms, and it shows at the same time how I arrived at such a typology. Namely, sensation tells you that there is something. Thinking, roughly speaking, tells you what it is. Feeling tells you whether it is agreeable or not, to be accepted or not, accepted or rejected.
Yes.
And intuition, now there is a difficulty. You find intuitive types, for instance, amongst bankers, Wall Street men.
Yeah.
They follow hunches, you know, gamblers of all descriptions.
Yeah.
You find the type very frequently among doctors because it helps them in their prognosis. It's just a sort of a skeleton to which you have to add the flesh. And so it is a means to an end. It only makes sense, such a scheme, when you deal with practical cases.
The Wheelwrights themselves are a vivid illustration of Jung's theory of types and of his view that opposite types attract and then get into conflict.
Everybody knows that women feel and men think. I mean, that's on page 3 of any book that you pick up. Well, in our family, it happens to be t'other way which. I can't think my way out of a paper bag, and my wife has an absolutely first-class mind.
Women are supposed to feel, and men are supposed to think. Jo did the feeling, and I did the thinking, and so we were upside down.
Tell me what Jung's theory of typology has meant to you in a personal way.
Well, I'm an introvert, and I'm a sensation type.
What does that mean exactly?
Sensation means facts. It's got to be a fact. You can't fool around with it. You've got to nail it down. It's got to be black and white. And then secondarily, thinking. And for a woman, that wasn't allowed in those days.
Her dominant functions were sensation and thinking.
That's
Yours were what?
my intuition and feeling. We're polar opposites.
In that order?
We're polar opposites. Yes, and she's very introverted, and I'm slightly extroverted.
Only slightly?
Only slightly, of course, fanatically.
For instance, it is very often the case, one could almost say, it is almost a rule, but I don't want to make too many rules in order not to be schematic, that an introvert marries an extrovert for compensation, or another type marries the counter type to complement himself.
Did that also mean that you were in conflict?
Lots of conflict. I didn't know what was going on half the time with him. And he was baffled by me.
We were saying very nasty things to each other and doing an awful lot of misunderstanding, and my relationship to Jane was then, as it has been always, the central fact of my life, I think. And so I wanted to do something about it. Our marriage would have probably had to break up if we'd gone on in blissful ignorance. And so that was. So that's what really brought me into Jungian psychology was the type stuff, and I've been hipped on it ever since. And I sort of, everybody dodges when they see me coming because they know I'm going to make a speech pretty soon about types.
Jung was 46 when he published Psychological Types. His practice in Kusnacht was prospering, his reputation growing, and he travelled widely. But his roots were in Switzerland. In 1923, Jung bought a piece of land at Bollingen. This amateur film shows him supervising the building work for his tower, which was to become his refuge and retreat. Jung's classical scholarship and his skills as a craftsman left their mark on the tower, giving shape and expression to images and symbols from his own dreams and his fertile unconscious. In later life, Jung immersed himself more and more in his own inner life at Bollingen, where he found a deep spiritual peace.
I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself. At times I feel as if I am spread out over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the plashing of the waves, in the clouds and animals that come and go, in the procession of the seasons. Without my piece of earth, my life's work would not have come into being.
Jung's father was a Protestant minister, and Jung himself found religion to be an inescapable reality of the human psyche. A few miles from Bollingen stands the Benedictine monastery of Einsiedeln, with its mysterious Black Madonna. Jung was a practical scientist who regarded the soul and the spiritual as realities of inner experience.
In the 19th century, one even tried to have a psychology without soul, and he was courageous enough to face soul, because the human soul is something very frightening. And what made him was that he was maybe frightened too, but able all the same to face it, to face psyche. We all have a religious side, and it was one of Jung's courageous statements saying that we cannot deal with the human psyche without having to deal with religion.
For him, religious realities are realities because they have effects. They bring about events in our psychic life and so on. Jung was a non-realist about religion. That is, he didn't think of religious objects as beings out there. He thought their true and most vivid meaning was within the psyche. So, for example, the real encounter with God was the encounter with your own unconscious.
Just a few months before he died, Jung summarized the religious emphasis of his life's work in a letter to an English correspondent.
It's an amazing letter. One of the passages that struck me most strongly was one where he says, "I have failed in my foremost task to open people's eyes to the fact that man has a soul, that there is a buried treasure in the field, and that our religion and philosophy are in a lamentable state." It's the human soul. That's the buried treasure.
Jung's work covered more than just clinical observation. He considered the psychological meaning of mythology and fairy tales, of alchemy, astrology, and flying saucers. He received honorary doctorates all around the world on his 80th birthday in 1955. Despite his vast range of work and thought, and the international reputation he had gained, Jung retained his humor and humility.
I made some comment about his encyclopedic knowledge. The reason it was so meaningful to me was that it didn't come out like knowledge, that it wasn't, he wasn't casting pearls before swine, and he wasn't preaching a gospel, and he wasn't doing any of those things. And he said, the older I get, and he was a child of about 75, I guess, and he said, the older I get, the more I realize that I don't know enough to entirely cover my little fingernail, to be room for a bit more.
Jung spent his life in the pioneering work of bringing together the conscious outer part of the psyche with the rich, deeper energies of the unconscious. When Carl Gustav Jung died and was buried in the family grave in the churchyard at Kusnacht, the village pastor declared he had given man the courage to have a soul again.